Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Been on another little hiatus, but we're getting better. We're getting a little more consistent than we were, and I'm happy to be joined today by Mr. Eric Darling Bond and by Mr. Chris Capola. Eric, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm as dandy as candy.
Dandy as candy.
Dandy as candy between donating plasma and then getting a nosebleed at the movies with my dad.
There you go. There you go. We call that living the dream. And I'm going to suggest to Chris that might not be a bad idea for him to say hi to the good people.
Hi to the good people.
Yeah, there we go. Now we're back on track. This is officially A Fork in Time. Today, when we gathered the team, we weren't sure what we were going to record about. We have lots of topics in the queue, but we don't always know who's going to be able to make a recording session because we don't always plan them as far in advance as we should to know what those topics are going to be. So if this works today, I will not take the credit for it, even though it's my idea. But if it doesn't work, I will take the blame for it. So I'm willing to go out there and take the lead. We thought we'd do something a little bit more, I guess, quote unquote, topical. In the sense of a lot of times we've said this on the podcast, we intentionally steer away from more modern topics and topics that we think may lead us down political discussions versus historical discussions. But there is an event going on in the world right now that is very difficult to ignore. And it's very difficult to ignore the fact that it's been a shadow over the world now for the better part of, well, we're getting really close to 75 years now, I guess. We'll be approaching 80 years before quick. And that's the existence of what goes on in the Middle East and particularly the modern state of Israel, particularly now, of course, the event that I have first and foremost in my mind is the present conflict that exists between the state of Israel and forces in the Gaza, primarily Hamas. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at least one. We may do a couple of these episodes. We're going to see how it rolls that are historical what ifs of what if we had a different version or maybe not even the existence of the modern state of Israel and what that would look like and how that would ripple through. But we thought we'd actually start before the 48 founding with the first break off here. And Chris, I'm going to pitch it over to you to sort of set us up for the historical what did and maybe what the historical branch off is here, and then we will do what we do here on A Fork in Time, which is go down the path.
So if it's a me episode, you know it's going to be a deep cut.
Here you go.
So the fork we're going to talk about today is going to be the 1936, it's called Arab Revolt, which was among the Arab/Muslim inhabitants of what was British mandatory Palestine. This is, again, it's a little bit of a deep cut, but to take it back a little bit to end of World War I, most people are a little familiar with what happened there with what's called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which basically divided the non-Turkish, the Arab lands of the Ottoman Empire between the British and the French. And you see this today. To this day, the modern nations of Israel, of Palestine, and Jordan, as well as Iraq, were going to be British. The modern nations of Lebanon and Syria were French. After the war, those two nations took over those areas in whatever capacity they decided to do it. The reason I'm a little dancing around it is they took over those areas as mandates. Right. This was after World War I. There was beginning of a decolonization move. The British Empire itself moved to a Commonwealth model with what would be called the settler colonies, Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, getting Dominion status. So they didn't come in and take it over the way it might have been elsewhere.
Right.
Another thing that happened in this period, in the World War I period, is the British Empire during the war, as an attempt to curry favor with Jews of the world, said they supported a Jewish homeland. Zionist being people who believed the Jews should have a land of their own. Most of them thought it should be in what is today Israel, Palestine, but there were also movements to give them land in Madagascar, and in very much like this European sense of like, well, we'll give them land, but we'll just throw somewhere else to them.
Yeah,
without much concern.
What land do we not need? What land do we not care about? What land can
Right.
we just have quote unquote laying around, right?
Right.
Argentina was one time discussed by Theodor Herzl in Der Judenstaat, where he made the argument for a Jewish state, and a whole chapter is on the question of like, so should we go to the Holy Land or Argentina? I guess the Holy Land.
Yeah, Argentina got a little less friendly pretty quick.
But people love Evita, Chris. It's a touchy subject for me, so I will calm down.
So that's what most people have heard about. What most people also just fast forward to, they skip from 1917, 1918, 1919.
Balfour Declaration, all the stuff that goes around that.
They jump right to 1948. Somehow they forget all about, the other international organization, the League of Nations, the Mandatory Palestine, all of that. And we're in 1948, we're after the Holocaust. There are Jewish refugees showing up in boats, and the world decides to finally give them their own country in 1948, the partition. And I believe we've talked about another episode on that, and we'll get to that. But what happened between is where we're going to go today. And in 1936, there was a revolt by the Palestinians against the British rule, against the British mandatory authority in Palestine. And that's what we're going to talk about today. What happened during this revolt, basically, the Nuremberg laws in Germany were passed in 1934-35. The Nazis are now in power, and it became very clear that things were going to go south pretty quick. German Jews among Jews in Europe tended to be better assimilated and tended to be wealthier. So a lot of them picked up sticks in ways that Jews in other nations may not have been able to. And a lot of them decided to go to Palestine. There were basically two places that they felt they could go, one being the West, the United States, if they could get in, but also Great Britain, one being Palestine. The British in Palestine basically were trying to balance these two forces. They were not like the idea of the colonial master is of India, and they're just running everything. They have the tiger by the ears and they don't want to let go in Palestine, because you have Arabs, you have Jews. Both parties are armed. Both parties are almost fighting each other already. And the British aren't getting a whole lot out of this. They're just trying to stay in charge somehow. And it leads to a giant general strike and then a revolt among the Palestinian population. And it takes the majority of the British army 3 years to put down this revolt. It finally ends in 1939. Don, what's the British Army doing in 1939?
Well, again, as we were talking off podcast, there's always Europe, right? We were talking actually about 19th century Europe, but it's now carried over into 20th century Europe. And they're about to be occupied in a major conflict, and they're in the position of about to have events that, will be, things like eventually will happen, like things like Dunkirk are not that far away, but they are engaged in what's going on in Europe and stopping the spread of Nazi Germany through what's happening there. Things like Poland are about to be invaded, other things like that. Um, Things that are much closer to home that have seeming much higher importance, I think have been on the radar for a while. And despite Chamberlain coming back, proclaiming peace in our time, it's not about to be peace in our time, and they're about to have to go to war on the continent proper again.
And this revolt I'm talking about, by the way, for those of you that have a mental calendar in your head, it officially ends. The last of it ends August 26th, 1939. That is after the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, before the actual invasion. It's like the critical week there that this thing actually frees up most of the British Army.
Is September 1 shortly after that, Chris? I guess is my question.
I'm counting out. August does have 31 days. So it's 5 days away rather than 4. But yes, it's very quickly approaching. That's what did happen. The British were finally successful in putting down the Arab revolt and immediately hopped right over to Dunkirk. What I'm proposing as a fork here is this. There are Palestinians and Arabs unhappy with British rule. We know they had contacts with Nazi Germany. Germany tells them to hold off, promises them support once the war that Germany is planning gets going. Because right now, yes, and I just got done stressing how close to the beginning of the actual war this got done with.
Right.
But it got done. And Britain doesn't have to worry about this at the same time. So the fork would be the intelligence and the logistic support trickles down to the Palestinians, and they decide we are going to hold off and wait until the Germans tell us to get cute again.
So I think it's a fascinating fork, Chris, because it's, again, one of the things we often talk about. Again, we've talked about this so many times, and maybe we'll get around to it. We often have the conversations off podcast before the prep conversations, and we will, one of the questions that will often get asked when a topic has been raised is, okay, what's the fork, right? That's the whole point. But then we will talk about making it a quote unquote plausible fork, or at least a, realistic enough fork that it's not fanciful. And, at first blush, it's like, no, that wouldn't have happened. Stranger things did and have happened than that. So I think it definitely falls in the category of, leaning more on the plausible side versus implausible. And, it's one of those things that I think it's going to be difficult to imagine the ripples because of all the interference that's already sort of in the pond, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But that's actually, I think, part of the dilemma here is that, how noticeable is that rock when big boulders are being thrown in the pond, right?
So there's two the other thing that coincides with this, the beginning of the revolt in April 1936, it's right after the remilitarization of the Rhineland, where most people that are, I'm not going to say familiar, but are really into it at our level know the orders of, we're going to march in. If anybody points a weapon at you, you run. You get back over the border. We are doing this, but we are in no way going to have this turn into a full-blown confrontation. We are not ready for it. So there is certainly a sense that that might be what they're aiming to do. They're aiming to get things quickly, but not for actual confrontation. The other question being, Britain is very much taking on a policy of appeasement over the course of this. How much of that, or does any of that change if their army is freed up? If they're not busy in Palestine, do they take a stronger line at Munich if they don't have this also going on at the same time?
So you're really arguing, if I'm hearing you correctly, or the thing to consider here in the fork is the two possible ways the fork does or does not have impact.
Mm-hmm.
If there's no, as you say, if there's no 1936 to 1939 thing that is occupying British interests and British military operations in a way that you're constantly having to think about it, even as you're looking at other risks or threats that are existing that are closer to home, that, let's be honest, you really probably care more about. Not that you don't care about your mandate in Palestine, but it's not quite as concerning as what's going on in Germany or noises being made towards France or all the things that are happening there.
Or Spain. Yeah.
And so one element of it is, what would you do different that has nothing to do with the territory that we call Palestine or the Middle East today? It has to do with how the ripple now comes back across to being closer to home. To your point, could you have been more aggressive? Could you have made a stance that was different because you had the ability to back it up? So that's the one thing. But there's also then what happens over in this territory that is still under dispute today that's part of the mandate, which is Palestine, because that is also changed because there's no containment of what's happening there in quite the same way from British forces if it's 1939 versus 1936, right?
Right. So first, I don't think it actually changes British appeasement, if I'm being honest. I don't think the availability of the British Army at this point changes much, just because there wasn't, the realization. We talked about the remilitarization of the Rhineland. The fact is, that was indisputably Germany.
Right.
Nobody said that wasn't German. So even this, the Anschluss with Austria in 1937, 1938, that is still bringing Germans into the German nation. Even technically, Munich in September 1938 is about bringing Germans into the German nation. It is only in March 1939, when Hitler invades Czechoslovakia and splits it up, that he takes on non-Germans. So I think that is a big point for the West realizing, waking up. And, after Munich, they started rearming, gaining the ability to actually do much against him. But I think you don't hear much about March 1939 as a wake up, hey, he's taking non-Germans. This is not that.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that goes with that, Chris, is I think we understand it from that historical sense. We've read about it. We've heard people talk about it. But remember, this is prior to the Second World War. The Great World War has been called the Great War, not the First World War, because we haven't had the second one yet, right? And the Great War, the psychological impact, we've talked about this in other episodes before, on the major players in that war, the nature of the warfare, the number of young men that die, the number that come back forever changed. This is true everywhere. It's more true in where the actual conflict took place. It's more true in France than in Germany. We talked about this, and even how the war comes to an end because of the influenza pandemic and other things where you just sort of running out of folks. But there is no great desire by Great Britain to go to war, because they still have the recent enough memory of what that last major conflict with European powers was about, including Germany.
I think the other important thing is comparing Versailles to Vienna.
Right.
Let's do a short little lesson on 19th century Europe, because I was going to go there. Even Britain, the the democratic nation, but also Russia and Austria, most of the countries of Europe recognized the Congress of Vienna as a just peace. Even France recognized the Congress of Vienna as a just peace. And there was a large reactionary element that would not allow any changes to the settlement of Vienna. John Maynard Keynes wrote as an advisor at Versailles that this plan can't work. Britain recognized very early on in the 1920s that Versailles could not work. So they were not going to defend the Versailles settlement. So all of these early things where they're giving in to Hitler, they're saying we're being reasonable. This is a reasonable adjustment to Versailles.
It's Versailles. It's Versailles amended, right? It's Versailles amended through inaction to a great degree, right?
Right.
If I may interject, it's also the fact that Britain felt like, oh, well, if there's going to be some global conflict, kind of like the US policy in the 50s and 60s, it would have been against the Soviets. And so Hitler, he may hate Jews, but he's an anti-communist, kind of the way we kept Franco in power in Spain following World War II. It was seen as like, well, he'll be a good bulwark against Stalin. So that's to where I see it, where they just allowed a lot of leeway of just like, well, he's keeping the commies in line. And then he signed the Ribbentrop non-aggression pact, and then that's when everybody was concerned.
I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah. So again, that's focusing a little bit on the European side of the fork here. Let's look at the Middle East, Palestine. I always struggle with what to call this because it's modern Israel, but it's historically Palestine. If we go back far enough, there are people going to get, well, we ought to be calling it Canaan. We ought, there's all kinds of things we could call it, right? So we're going to call it Palestine just to establish that's what we're calling it, because that was the mandate of which it functioned under as well.
Mandatory Palestine.
Right.
Mandatory Palestine is a political entity which includes the modern territories of Gaza, the internationally recognized borders of Israel, the West Bank, and Jordan as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Because, again, this is what was decided after the sick man of Europe finally fell down in the case of the Ottoman Empire, right? And what happened as we draw towards the end of World War I and the rise of modern Turkey at the fall of the historic Ottoman Empire. So 1930, let's start with 1936 and then jump forward. 1936 Palestine. Generally, what is that like?
It is. No, please go ahead, Eric.
I would say it is what was once a kind of blended society during the Ottomans. There were conflicts, of course, and they too played different ethnic groups against each other, but it was for the most part blended, whereas the British are very more keen to keep groups separated and played against each other. The Zionists against the Palestinians and other Arab groups against each other because it made it easier for them to administer directly. And the thing is, Zionists were in the region before the British, and they had tried to make deals with the Ottoman Empire to create a protectorate there. Then during the war, there were several Jewish groups who spied for the British under the understanding of like, okay, will you help our claim to a Jewish state after the war? And Britain said yes to them, and to the Arabs, and to the Palestinians, and mostly to the French and themselves. So it's a society with very clear ethnic tensions, kind of like Ireland before this time. I guess the British are just good at that.
Well, and this is a common theme. I think I mentioned earlier. This is a common theme of these during the colonial period. Even now, as you mentioned, Chris, this is sort of colonial transition into mandates and mandatory period. it has a lot of similarities, even while it has differences, is the way that I think of it in my head. And again, it's these arbitrary broad strokes that are drawn on maps that have little to do with sometimes even the people who've drawn the boundaries and drawn the lines, understanding why having these diverse groups inside of the lines is going to be automatically a source of conflict. We see this all throughout Africa, where it's not even understanding the tribal issues there and the territorial issues and how things get drawn, even as things are coming apart. And so I tend to think of this as just being I don't want to say it's colonialism light, because that's not a fair way to describe it, but it's colonialism in transition, and it ain't democracy yet, just by any stretch of the imagination. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And
I would say it's a transitionary period under the assumption that we'll never have to transition out of this. It was that's always been my take on the situation of Britain was never intending to partition India. They were never planning to let go. We know this from like what happened in Kenya around this time with Operation Legacy, to where they were trying to basically make these colonies utterly dependent on them.
I would argue that this revolt is the beginning of the British realizing that it's not worth it. The beginning of the British saying we need to get out. And there's absolutely a pause for 6 years for some reason in 1939, but they pick right back up, and in 1945 the entire period from 1945 to 1948, 47, 48 is them trying to figure out how to get out.
Yeah. And more than happy to do it after they've, and then, and by the way, if we can do that, we can toss the potato over from the hot potato over from being a mandate to this newly created organization called the United Nations. So they have to pick it up and figure it out and peel it and saute it or whatever they're going to do to this hot potato. That's great. It's not us, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And so let's go down the Palestinian side of the fork a little bit. I think this has been a good topic. I've enjoyed this so far, whether our listeners have or not. I don't know. At the end of the day, if we're enjoying ourselves, we know that most of our listeners who have found us probably will enjoy it. That's one of the things we've learned over time. So nothing happens in 36. Those that are there that agitated for the reasons they agitated in 36. Agitate is the wrong word, perhaps, because it connotates something, but the choice to engage in a revolt in 36 is delayed with the idea that help in a different form is coming, because we've already had conversations with this state on the rise that's returning back, that's in rebirth in the case of Germany. So let's say they wait, let's say we know September 1 for two different dates. Let's say we know it for Poland, September 1 of 39 for Poland. And oh, by the way, while that's going on, meanwhile, just a little further over on the globe, this is started up in Palestine. Let's just make them synonymous, just for the sense of making them synonymous, right?
I actually say it's pushed a little bit further.
Okay.
Because I do want to tie it to something else. August 1941.
August of 41. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And there's a real historical thing, a reason I want to get to it.
Okay. Lay it on us.
So, in August of 41, a couple of things have happened. First, obviously, France fell.
Right.
When we talked about the two countries dividing up the Middle East, it was Great Britain, Great Britain, Great Britain. Who was the other one?
I think it was France, Chris.
It was France. So you always hear, after France fell, of course, Britain was worried about the air bases that are now attacking them. But throughout the French Empire, there were issues with what happens to us. We never got occupied. There were no Germans around us. So you had the attacks on Mirz el-Kabir in North Africa, where basically Churchill sent the British Navy in and said, hey, listen, entire French Mediterranean Navy, You either join us or we're going to attack you. And the British attacked the French. That's one thing that a lot of people don't know about. But yes, it created a lot of problems for the Free French, for Charles de Gaulle, who's, one general, but the legitimate government of France is telling him he's a traitor and doing something else.
Right.
But the important part here is twofold. One, the French Vichy government is in control in Syria and in Lebanon. Number two, the Germans, and I'm going to say the Italians as well, had a role in it, but it was really the Germans, just took over Greece. Now have all of this power in the southeastern Mediterranean. And they've got a foothold, theoretically, in the actual Middle East with the friendly Vichy government in Syria, Lebanon. What actually happened, and this is history, this is not, our fork. There was a military revolt in Iraq against the British puppet. Actually, this was the guy that was descendant of Lawrence of Arabia's friend, the people that supported him. They did not give them the thrones in actually Saudi Arabia, but they gave them the thrones in Iraq and Jordan. He got overthrown in an explicitly pro-Axis military coup organized by somebody I should have mentioned earlier, Ayman al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who's a religious leader of the Palestinian population there and is explicitly pro-German. He is the person who led the 36 revolt and would have had the contacts with the Germans that led to our fork of them saying, hold off on this. The Germans and the Italians did try and fly supplies and flew some planes through Syria to support the Iraqi revolt. But the fact is they didn't get enough. Germany never actually made a point of it because this is right when Barbarossa is starting. They're not paying attention to much else. And the British were able eventually to squash it. But what if the entire British Middle East just rose up? By the way, there's a little guy named Rommel who's already at El Alamein.
Yeah.
Maybe 70 miles from Alexandria. So now you have no strategic depth for the entire British Middle Eastern Command. That's the big deal.
So that definitely changes the situation on the ground. Throughout a large part of what we think of as being the war in 41 and 42, that's not what's going on with Barbarossa having been launched and what's going into the Soviet Union, because basically in the Atlantic Wall is being built. The western portion of the conflict is an aerial campaign at this point, waiting to see what's going to happen. And again, you've also picked a time when who's not in the war yet? Who's not in the war yet? It's August of 41, right?
Right. United States has,
The United States is not there. In fact, we've talked about this, I think, on a different episode. We just recently passed this date with the commemoration of December 7th again, is that really strange thing we talked about, would the United States and Germany have initially even started out? I mean, there was already Lend-Lease, there was already things that were going on, the support for, the Free French and all the other things that were there. But it wasn't until Germany, after December 7th, in support of its ally, the Japanese, declares war on the United States, that the reciprocal act occurs from the United States back against Germany, and then the hostilities are fully on. And it's so easy. I think of 1941 as the year in my head, but it's real easy for me to forget we're talking about mere weeks in 1941 when the United States is in the war. Not a whole year. Yes, they enter the war in 1941. For all intents and purposes, they've entered the war except for Lend-Lease in 1942 in terms of actually entering the war.
I'd really say it's the second half of 41 that matters.
Right.
between Russia and the United States, both of them. And by the way, this is something else that, I think I've thrown out there, and we will eventually do this. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor because they were going to attack the British
Right.
and the Dutch in Southeast Asia. By the way, like I was mentioning, the Vichy French have no idea who they're supposed to be behind. Southeast Asia, Vietnam is under the Japanese control because of Vichy cooperation with the Japanese. There were no treaties between the United States and any of these European colonial powers. And it's a very interesting question as to whether the Japanese even needed to attack the United States.
Right. Yeah. The
But-
United States was very happy in its isolationist. This is not other than aiding our longstanding, ties to England and helping them with material, not with men, but with material. This is not our fight.
Right.
This is not our fight. And so that's there. So what actually happens? Is it just a fait accompli in Palestine in 41?
I absolutely think it is, because it was very near run for the British in Iraq before they actually had a chance to really react. And again, kind of like we were saying, Britain has to economize its forces. It only has so much, especially after Dunkirk.
Right.
And they're very happy that there is such a thing as a North African campaign, because they can actually be in action against Germany somewhere. But I think the rising in Palestine just collapses them. I think it just presents so many problems for them. Because here's the other thing. We've talked about mandatory Palestine today. We've talked about this area. What was the international border between 1967 and 1978, 79 between Israel and Egypt?
Let's see. You have the occupied.
It was the
Sinai.
Suez Canal.
Right. You've had the occupied Sinai up to the canal, right?
It was right up to the canal. So if you have pro-Axis forces in mandatory Palestine with any support, now the British and Egypt are fighting on two fronts. And they had enough. They literally had to withdraw. The reason El Alamein happened where it did is because of something called the Qatar Depression. And the Qatar Depression is a giant sand pit where you can't move anything. So literally it extends up, and there's maybe 20-mile front where you can actually move around in North Africa. That's why they stood there, because they didn't have enough manpower and enough equipment to defend a wider front. Now you've got another one, and by the way, that cuts off the Suez Canal.
Yep.
It gets very dicey for them very quickly.
It changes the tactical and the strategic situation together in a way that is there. So let's assume that it is the fait accompli. This is now Axis friendly, Axis controlled, whatever you want to call this territory now that has happened there in Palestine and the other areas that are there. What's the ripple through the war? I mean, at the end of the day, it's probably inevitable that once Germany opens the second front, we've talked about this so many times before. It's hard to imagine the scenario where Germany wins the war. Maybe they stalemate things, or we've talked about other ways that World War II could have turned out. Is this a big enough game changer to really impact in the long run the course of the war, either in terms of its length or where lines get drawn or things get settled? Or is this ultimately just a footnote to a different way that we think about the Second World War?
I think it is absolutely a length changer. Not an outcome changer, but it definitely changes the characteristics of it for two reasons. One, I think the British wind up falling back into Cairo, Upper Nile area. And that is where the American fight back starts from. Especially because of one thing, and I talked a little bit about Mirza Kabir over in French Algeria. I think if the Germans use the bases in the French Middle East, Syria, and Lebanon, you have a firmer control, you have a stronger connection between the Vichy government and its colonial possessions. If you look at why one of the reasons the United States went into North Africa the way it did when it did in October of 42 is we weren't sure the French were actually going to fight us. These were Vichy French. And again, because there was this question as to which French government are they going to listen to?
Right.
Most of them wound up supporting the United States. You know, they didn't really fight that much, but they did. I think if you've already had Vichy forces engaged in Syria, Lebanon, one, they have tighter control over the forces in Algeria, Morocco. The other thing is the United States, in planning this, doesn't think it's going to be as easy. Doesn't think, well, we're just going to have to show up, wave a flag, and the entire, Vichy government's going to surrender to us. So I think what the United States winds up doing is, and again, this is a lot harder, but going in through Ethiopia, going in through Kenya, and supporting a drive up the Nile into what is today North Africa, into the Middle East. But it is a much bloodier fight. And I think one of the, maybe I could envision kind of like Pershing in World War I, the United States was very, very big on having its own front. And I think it may be that once you reach kind of that Y of northern Egypt, the United States says we're gonna take the Middle East. Because the British, you made a hash of this, and you just don't have a very good name over there. But it definitely makes it longer and harder. It makes communication harder, getting British support in. It makes also, by the way, this opens up a threat to Persian oil. They mounted again, real history, United States and Russia, not the United States. This was Great Britain and Soviet Union, mounted a coup against the Shah's father.
Right.
The Shah that, everybody knows about. His father was deposed because he was too friendly with Germany. Well, now you got Germany next door. What does that do to Persian oil? Maybe you can't remove him that easily.
Yeah, and we even talked about, there's an episode way back, I forget which one. I actually want to think that it was our friend Brent Frost who was actually when we were talking about Barbarossa, and just how that could have been different if you actually have German seizure of petroleum assets in a way that changes the picture there, in terms of ultimately what is, there's a lot of things that are the doom of Germany, but one of the things that's the doom of Germany is just a lack of the resources that you need, and that is one of the primary resources for modern warfare, which is called fuel, and you just don't have it.
And I'm not saying that this would necessarily mean the Germans do have it. There were the oil fields of Mosul today were known about. Saudi Arabia wasn't, but I think you still have the British Navy. They would still have to ship it. I think you can make it harder for the British to get. And that's the effect of this, not necessarily opening up those spigots for German usage.
It's not what you're able to consume. It's what you make it more difficult for your enemy to access and consume, right?
access and get where they want it.
Right.
That's to get it where they need it. They need to be able to take oil from the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, from Abdan in the Persian Gulf, and get it to Scapa Flow.
Right. And and one of the things, one of the lessons for me of World War II, modern warfare as well, even World War I, particularly World War II, is it's easy to talk about the battles. The battles are won as a result of the logistics and the supply lines and the effectiveness of those things. I mean, ultimately, Eisenhower's brilliance as a military commander can be argued as he was someone who understood logistics in terms of what had to be done in the European theater. And that was as important as understanding what to do when there was actually bullets and tanks and planes involved, at least in my opinion. So does this prolong the war?
100%.
How long?
At least a year. At least. Best case scenario, it prolongs it 1 year.
Do you think it leads to a scenario where there is an end to the war that is not the end of Germany as we know it in the classic sense? For example, does it buy enough time that, stuff like the Stauffen plan and other things like that, something like that comes to be where there's a chance for a salvaged German something out of the war just because it lasts longer and that's more time to buy something that ends the way that it ended under Hitler? That's the first thing that pops into my head.
I don't think so. I think you had reached the point that it was going to be unconditional surrender. It was, okay, fine. Then we'll let Stauffenberg be captured by the Russians in Berlin in 1946. It's just a different name. We're not going to negotiate with anybody.
Okay.
What was the name of the Treasury Secretary who suggested post-Germany should be cut off from all of its industrial?
Henry Morgenthau. And he created a whole bunch of propaganda in Germany by doing that. In fact, I believe that we actually addressed that in an episode with Brandt.
Yeah, I think so too. I remember us going down a couple of those. This is when we were trying to prevent world wars over a period of time. It took until episode 100 to get it done, Chris. So
and by the way, that was still the one episode where I completely threw out the practicality in our pre-recording discussion. I said, no, there's absolutely no way this can happen, but we're going to go there.
Right. So again, it was a false victory in terms of doing it because it was all based upon a non-plausible premise to begin with, right?
Right. Well, are the Soviets able to get more into Western Europe since the Allies are now having even more time taken up having to fight a veritable larger front in the Middle East?
I think there's two things to say about this. First, I think we may see a North and South Iran. We actually did see Soviet occupation zones in northern Iran, and one of the first things that happened that soured the alliance between the West and the Soviet Union in 1945, even in 45, is the Soviets were a little hesitant to actually withdraw all of their troops from northern Iran. So I think you possibly see, like I said, if Iran actually still decides to play cute with the Nazis, you may see, I think that country gets occupied and is occupied in a way that it has been in the past. So maybe that is not a unified political entity. The other thing is, I think a large part of the Soviet successes in 43, at least 43 onwards, are because the Germans are distracted. Because they're fighting in Italy, they're fighting in France. And I think a big part of that is again, like economizing of your forces. The reason the Soviets are able to make the advances they are is because the Germans are distracted. The other thing I would say is, if you're envisioning this war centered on the southeastern Mediterranean, which this would be, you actually have a Churchillian idea that may develop, which would be a Balkan invasion. Churchill wanted, instead of going into Italy, he wanted to go up into the Balkans. Especially, he wanted that instead of France. But the reason he wanted to go into the Balkans is, if you're just looking at a map, hey, look, the Soviets are coming in. If you're coming up from the Balkans, you meet them a lot quicker and therefore can eat up territory before they can get to it. So maybe you would see a pro-Western Tito, a pro-Western Bulgaria, where maybe the Iron Curtain slashes a little differently across Europe.
More of an east-west kind of flow than a north, in the sense of the longitude, the direction of the curtain versus what it divides, right? Would be more, a little bit more north-south versus east-west.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's an interesting concept there. So let's sort of bring this around to a close as a concept here. So the assumption is eventually, Germany is destined to lose. Mm-hmm. Where the lines get drawn, where forces are, why forces are there. You just mentioned some of the reasons, Chris, that things may be a little bit different. But eventually you end up with a non-Axis, non-German aligned Palestine that had been the Palestinian Mandate. Now, after the war, it's not the British necessarily. It might be, but probably not the British. We don't know for sure who's in charge there in this alternate timeline.
Probably the U.S.
I don't think the U.S. Here's the very dangerous question I'm looking at here. First, if the mandatory Palestine is occupied by forces of Ayman al-Husseini, the existing Jewish population in that area is almost certainly going to be wiped out. He tried to wipe it out during the revolt. He tried to do everything he could to wipe it out, and if he is in control, he is going to do it himself. I think lengthening the war also reduces the number of refugees that can come. I think you have a Jewish homeland. I also think one of the reasons I think that the early wars played out the way they did, the 48 Independence War played out the way it did, because both of these sides were on the British side in some way or another during World War II. The Egyptian army was equipped and trained by the British because of the fighting in the Western Desert. The Jordanian, what would become the Jordanian army, the Arab Legion, was an armed force equipped, trained by the British to fight with them in the Desert War. The Haganah, the Jewish defense forces, had fought with the British. If one side had picked against the British, I don't think you have any prevarication. I don't think you have because remember, the United Nations its charter was in 1945, but it was kind of founded in Newfoundland. The United Nations was the name of the Allies in World War II.
Right.
Interestingly enough, they were kind of very slow to readmit Spain and other, friendly fascist powers. I think a UN plan for mandatory Palestine after this scenario, Jerusalem might be an international city. Don't forget, the UN plan did not give Israel its pre-67 borders.
Correct.
The UN plan was going to give Israel the north and was going to keep the desert Palestinian. I think you have at least pre-67 borders given to Israel because the Palestinians lost this war. They explicitly picked a side and lost. And as happened in 48, when you do that, bad things happen to you.
Right. There's consequences of that choice, right? Yeah. Any thoughts, Eric, before we sort of close things out? This one's been an interesting one. I have a lot of thinking to do about. I have a lot of thinking to do about this episode. More than I think we came to conclusions. It's just an interesting thing to think about as we maybe talk about some of the other things that are along maybe this same sort of broad concept of moving forward in time, changing it this early. Eric, did we miss anything that you had in your hand?
No, we covered the likely pogrom of what would happen to the Jews of mandatory Palestine. I'm a little emotionally tender right now that I'm trying to keep things a little close to the chest.
Okay.
Nothing like I'm not. It's a difficult feeling to explain. Basically, okay. I'm gonna try and sum up.
If I can jump in, Eric, while you get yourself together. You remember how I was talking about German Jews being better assimilated and being able to get out while others may not have been? Not a whole lot of them made it to places such as Great Britain, but I did. But I mentioned that only because my grandmother spent the Blitz in London because of that.
Yeah. My ancestors left Russia during the Reformation and then became Protestants. It's a weird thing. It's a very weird story. They ended up in Switzerland, and one of them got contracted essentially to be a soldier for pilgrims coming over. Very long story. I can't get into it right now. But, I reconverted to Judaism in my early 20s. And just to be open with you guys, I did not used to be a Zionist. Only because, not in the fact that I thought Israel didn't deserve to be a state. I thought it did. But I always looked on it with suspicion whenever other people talked in support of it, because I was like, the Europeans saw it as a place to just dump their Jewish populations after World War II because they didn't want to give them their land back. It's a lot easier to dump them on somebody else's back door than it is to give them the property they stole from them. So that's why I get a little emotionally tender. Now I've come to the point in my life to where it's like, I think having a Jewish state is a valuable thing. I do get uncomfortable when I meet fellow Jews who are telling me it's a religious duty for us to have the Holy Land. And it's like, well, the religious Jews didn't seem to think fondly of it at the beginning because originally it was seen as an escape from religion to have a secular Jewish state, not a religious Jewish state. So that's why current events are very frustrating for me.
Yeah. And the fair thing that I would say there, Eric, and thanks for being transparent about that. I really do value that. I think a lot of people understand that. Is I mentioned off podcast, and I'll mention now. Part of the reason this was a tough topic to even go to is how do you address this historical topic through the prism of what's going on now? And regardless of where you stand on this Israeli-Hamas conflict, the thing you should be able to agree upon is there have been horrible things that have occurred in the last 2 months in everyone's name and for everybody's justified reasons that they want to give for doing them. And some of them have a sense of justification, but a lot of people are dead. And it's very difficult. What I find challenging about this, we've talked about this. I'll just say this now. I think we talked about it on an episode here recently. We certainly talked about it among the team off podcast about our willingness to go more towards topics that are a little bit closer to now and how we would do that. One of the things that we talked about there was, among the people that we've assembled here that like each other and also love history the way that we do, and we do this together and we enjoy doing it together, is we don't all see things the exact same way. And we know that, but we also know how to disagree and think it through and discuss it in a way that doesn't, even when it becomes emotional, that it doesn't become hateful or bitter. And so that's a difficult thing to do, by the way. You can have, as Eric does here in his expressor, you can have strong emotions about something. But you can also detach yourself enough from those very strong emotions that come for a very real reason, and what Chris was mentioning as well, to look back and say, okay, but why do other people think about this differently than I do? Can I understand their point of view? And to me, that's the healthy thing that we've lost so much. I'll just say this in our American political dialogue and in our world political dialogue is the ability to take a step back and say, I don't agree with you, but let me try to understand why you think the way that you do, because I might change my mind or it might change how I interact with it. And that's a healthy place for us to be. And so if we can do that as a little bitty, several hundred listener podcast, I think we've done some good there, even if it's not always easy for us to do. So that this concludes the public service announcement, and I will now get off my soapbox. But that's the reason where you're going to see us a little bit more willing to step into some of these topics that have more of a current theme to them. Is we think we're adults enough to be able to do it in a way that's responsible. And unfortunately, I see a lot of media that is not even as responsible as we are, to be honest. And I'll just leave it at that. I do think it's also. Go ahead, Eric.
I will say for the topic at hand, I do think we do see the creation of a Jewish state. I do think Chris has it right on the money that it is pre-1967 borders.
At least.
At least. I'm interested to see what are the results on the Jewish population, like to see figure. Gosh, I wish I could remember his name offhand, but he's the guy who wrote "Let Us Not Go Like Lambs into the Slaughter." And there was a Jewish resistance fighter who eventually teamed up with the Soviets in Eastern Germany, and he, after the war, attempted to spearhead an effort to kill 6 million Germans as revenge. It did not work out. He was arrested in mandatory Palestine because he tried going to the Haggadah to get support, and they quickly turned him over to the Brits for a year. And he actually later then spoke at the trial for Adolf Eichmann. But it's a very interesting story. So I'm wondering if there would be more people after the war who would say, like, yeah, why not take it back? I'm interested to see what would the level of extremism be following the war.
I would very much say, I think it would be a very different status. The Palestinians are there, and you have two options. You can live next door to them, or you can go down the German route. That is not acceptable, period.
Yeah.
I think what you would see is more Palestinian displacements into an ethnically homogeneous state, into probably Jordan. The Gazans go to Egypt, the Palestinians in the West Bank go to Jordan, and so you have the character of this conflict being more like you saw in 56, 67, 73. This is an interstate conflict. These are armies and air forces fighting each other. These are not civilian militias grabbing some guns and going after each other. So I think it's a very different nature of the conflict. And I think the conflict may not serve, I think I just realized, hey, yeah, that was the majority of the conflict for a lot of the time was interstate war. I think what you have is one, that's what it is from the very beginning. You don't have an occupation because you don't have Palestinians living there. The international community says you picked the wrong side. This is no longer your land. And so you don't have that ongoing sore. I think you do see a dynamic that we did see in our timeline, or maybe more of it, which is the West supporting the state of Israel, the Soviet bloc supporting the Arab powers. But guess what? And it is not lost on me that the Oslo Accords occurred almost immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the power supporting definitely right. Syria, Egypt for a long part of
when the fights you're willing to pick with the kids down the block when you no longer have your big brother to back you up are a little bit different, right?
And I think it could have settled by now because it is an interstate, not an intercommunal conflict.
Right. And to me, that is the challenge of what makes this. Because the other thing I should just say that, the other thing that strikes me when I watch the news, and the news is hard for me to watch a lot these days. I'm going to be honest. I do because that's what responsible adults do to keep track of what's going on in the world. But then even in the midst of this conflict, again, not taking quote unquote sides on this conflict, but then you also see the people connecting because of some of the hostage situations and things like that. We're talking about Jews and Palestinians who are like, this just needs to stop, regardless of who's right or wrong. People, our kids, our families are being hurt here. This just needs to stop. And so, that gives me that little bit of hope down inside of it, in the sense that, to your point, Chris, when it's about nations fighting each other, it's one thing. It's different when you're fighting with your neighbor next door, if that's really your neighbor next door.
Yeah.
By the way, it can also get nasty with the neighbor next door. It doesn't always mean that it's better, but it does mean that it's different. So, all right. Any closing thoughts here before I close this out? All right. We thank you, our listeners here. Just a couple of quick things. We encourage you to visit the website. That's www.aforkintimepodcast.com. All kinds of fun stuff there. Find out a little bit more about the shows. The shows being also The Room Where It Happened. We still have that show around. We still record episodes for that every now and again. Also, the other things that we have there, places to give us feedback and suggestions. Do you recommend our Discord, which is a place to sort of interact with us in real time? You can go and leave us just a suggestion or feedback there on the website proper, or get the connection there. You'll also find it in the show notes to our Discord. Actually had somebody pop up in the Discord just this morning, because things have been sort of quiet in the Discord with no episodes out there, going, hey, what's going on? It's quiet around here. And I said, stay tuned. Some stuff coming to you. But we've had a lot of fun there interacting with our listeners sort of in closer to real time, where more of the members of the team will jump on and respond back. Certainly, we're always looking for topic suggestions. We don't lack for them. We have a list now that we will probably never get to the bottom of, but that doesn't mean better ones don't come in and we don't jump them to the top because we find them more interested. So feel free to let us know. And almost everybody that's on the show here now that's not either myself or Alexis came to us as a result of suggesting a topic and me reaching out and saying, hey, you want to join us? So you understand, you may suggest a topic and you may hear from us saying, hey, that's interesting. Want to come talk to us about it? Because that's one of the ways that we grow the community as well. So I don't think I have anything else to cover. Oh, by the way, if you are interested in some, we're coming up on the holiday season. I guess we're into Hanukkah now, coming up on the Christmas season. Kwanzaa's out there as well. And we have merch there on the, if you fancy the Fork in Time mug or a tumbler or a shirt or anything that's going there, then let me, you can go there and find how to get those things. They make excellent gifts. Just saying. That's all I'm saying here now. And I have a little bit more than 8-week-old grandson now, Alexis's son, who's coming to the world here in late October. For example, he may have a Fork in Time onesie in his future. That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. All right. So on behalf of Eric and Chris, this is Don signing off. And we're going to remind you, as we always do, if you happen upon a fork in time, our strong suggestion is to take it. Thanks, guys.
Happy Hanukkah, Don. Happy Hanukkah, Chris.
Happy Hanukkah to you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.